When my daughter, Isabel Whitfield, died in my arms at 38 years old, I never imagined that the real pain would begin at her own funeral. That was when the man who had abandoned her 10 years earlier appeared, dressed in mourning clothes and demanding the $29 million she had left for me. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel, hit the notification bell because we have new stories every day. Leave a like and tell us in the comments what city you're watching from. My name is Robert Whitfield. I'm 68 years old, and for the last 4 months, I lived through the greatest hell of my life, watching cancer slowly take my only daughter. Isabel was my world ever since her mother passed away when she was just 12. I raised her alone. I worked day and night to give her the best education, and I swelled with pride when she became a successful entrepreneur with her own chain of fashion boutiques in New York and Los Angeles. On March 15th, 2024, Isabel called me into her hospital room. Her eyes, which once shone with determination, now reflected the serenity of someone who knows the end is near. "Dad," she said to me in a weak but firm voice, "I need you to know something very important. I've been preparing everything for you." She handed me a sealed envelope with documents that would change my life forever. When I opened that envelope that same night at home, I couldn't believe what I was seeing. Isabel had amassed a fortune of $29 million through her businesses and investments. In her will, drafted with David Caldwell, our trusted attorney, she named me as her sole universal heir. "Dad, you were both a father and a mother to me. No one else deserves what I built with so much effort," she had written in a personal letter accompanying the documents. Isabel passed away on March 22nd, 2024, at 6:47 in the morning. I was holding her hand when she took her last breath. In that moment, I felt a piece of my soul leave with her. The following days passed in a blur of pain, paperwork, and funeral preparations. On March 25th, the day of the funeral, the church was packed with Isabel's family, friends, and business associates. I was in the front pew, devastated by grief, when someone touched my shoulder. I turned and saw a tall man, about 42 years old, in an elegant black suit and tie, with tears streaming down his cheeks. "Robert," he said in a broken voice, "I'm David Jennings. I'm so sorry for the loss of our dear Isabel." For a moment, I didn't react. Our dear Isabel? This man had the nerve to show up after a decade of total abandonment and speak as if he had been a part of my daughter's life. David had been Isabel's husband for only 2 years, from 2012 to 2014. When she told him she was pregnant in January of 2014, he disappeared overnight, leaving her alone with their marital debts and a pregnancy that sadly ended in a miscarriage due to the stress. "What are you doing here, David?" I asked him in a low voice, trying to maintain my composure in that sacred place. "I came to say goodbye to the woman I loved," he replied, wiping his tears with a white handkerchief. "Isabel and I had our problems, but she was always special to me." What infuriated me most was seeing how he acted in front of the other attendees. He took a seat in the second row, right behind me, and sobbed theatrically. Several people who didn't know the story approached to console him, thinking he was the grieving widower. He even walked up to the casket at the end. He placed his hand on the wooden surface and whispered something I couldn't hear. After the church service, we headed to the cemetery. Throughout the journey, David stayed close to the family, as if he had a right to be there. His behavior seemed increasingly strange and calculated. It wasn't the genuine grief of someone who had lost a loved one, but something more artificial. As the casket was being lowered, David approached me again. "Robert, we need to talk after this. There are important things we need to discuss about Isabel and, well, about the future." Those words sent a chill down my spine. The future? What future was a man who had abandoned my daughter at the most difficult moment of her life talking about? In that instant, I knew David hadn't come to the funeral just to say goodbye. He had other plans, and something told me they wouldn't be good for Isabel's memory, or for the peace I so desperately needed in that moment of grief. After the burial, while the other guests headed to the reception at my sister Eleanor's house, David stayed behind, waiting for me by his black Mercedes. His attitude had changed completely. He was no longer feigning the theatrical grief of the funeral. Now, he wore a calculated smile that set my nerves on edge. "Robert, I think it's time we talk frankly," he said, lighting a cigarette. "Isabel was my wife, legally speaking, and according to the law, I have rights to her estate." I was frozen. Rights? This scoundrel thought he could show up, after a decade of total silence, and claim what Isabel had built with her own sweat and sacrifice. "David, you and my daughter were divorced in August of 2014. You have no right to anything," I replied, staying calm even though I was seething with indignation inside. But that's where you're wrong, Pops," he said with that arrogant smirk. "I've been doing some research, and it turns out Isabel never properly completed all the divorce paperwork. Technically, we were still married in certain legal aspects. My lawyers have confirmed that I can claim at least half of those $29 million she accumulated." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. This crook had been planning everything for a long time. He knew about Isabel's fortune, and had come like a vulture to claim his share of the loot. "How dare you!" I shouted, losing my composure for the first time. "You abandoned my daughter when she needed you most. You left her alone, pregnant, and drowning in debt. You disappeared like a coward. And now, 10 years later, you come here talking about rights?" David threw his cigarette on the ground and looked at me coldly. "Look, Robert, I understand you're hurting, but feelings don't change the law. Isabel built that business empire, yeah, but when we were a couple, I also contributed to the start of her business. I have documents to prove it. It was a lie, and I knew it. And Isabel had started her first store in 2016, 2 years after the divorce, with a loan I had helped her get. David had never invested a single dollar in my daughter's dreams. Listen to me closely," he continued, his voice menacing. "We can do this the easy way or the hard way. If you voluntarily give me my share, say $15 million, we'll avoid a long and costly lawsuit that will tarnish Isabel's memory in every newspaper in the country." There it was at David Jennings's true face. He wasn't just an opportunist. He was a blackmailer, willing to use my deceased daughter's good name to get money. "Are you threatening me?" I asked, stepping closer to him. "No, I'm offering you a civilized solution. But if you'd rather the media find out that the father of successful businesswoman Isabel Whitfield is denying her widower the rights he's entitled to," he left the sentence hanging in the air. In that moment, I vividly remembered the day David abandoned Isabel. It was January 28th, 2014. Isabel called me, crying, at 11 p.m., telling me she had come home to find a note on the kitchen table. "I'm leaving. This isn't working. Don't try to contact me." That was it. He didn't even have the courage to say goodbye in person, or explain why he was running away when she needed support most. Over the next few weeks, Isabel discovered that David had emptied their joint bank account, taking $12,000, which were her savings for her future business. He also left unpaid bills for the apartment they shared, forcing Isabel to take on debts she hadn't incurred. The most painful part was when Isabel lost the baby in March of 2014. She tried to contact David to tell him about the tragedy, but he had changed his phone number and blocked her on all social media. My daughter had to go through the grief of losing her child and her marriage at the same time, all alone. "You know what, David?" I said. With a calm, I didn't know you're right about one thing. This can be done the easy way or the hard way. But I promise you that if you try to tarnish my daughter's name with your lies, I'll show you what I'm capable of. David let out a sarcastic laugh. "You're going to scare me, old man? I'm 42 and you're 68. Besides, I have resources and connections you can't even imagine. My offer is on the table. 15 million now or 20 million after the lawsuit, plus all of the legal fees it's going to cost me to destroy your reputation. Get out of here before I do something I'll regret," I warned him. "You have 1 week to think about it," he said as he got into his Mercedes. "Next Monday you'll receive the legal documents. I hope you reconsider your position, because this is just getting started." As I watched his car drive away, I felt a mix of rage and determination I hadn't experienced in years. This man thought he could take advantage of a father's grief, but he had messed with the wrong person. Isabel had taught me to fight for what is right, and that's exactly what I was going to do. That night, in the solitude of my home, surrounded by photos of Isabel from childhood to her final days, I made a decision that would change everything. I wasn't going to give David a single penny, and I would do everything in my power to unmask his true intentions in court. The day after my encounter with David, I decided to start my own investigation. I couldn't sit idly by, waiting for his legal threats. If this man had planned everything with such precision, I needed to find out what else he was hiding. My first stop was the office of David Caldwell, the attorney who had drafted Isabel's will. David, a 55-year-old man with more than 20 years of experience in probate law, met with me that same morning at his office. "Robert, I am so sorry for your loss," he said, as he reviewed the documents Isabel had signed. "I want you to know that your daughter's will is absolutely irrefutable. She was very specific in her instructions and was in full use of her mental faculties when we drafted it. David, I need you to investigate David Jennings. He says he has a right to Isabel's inheritance, but I know he's lying." David took notes as I recounted the conversation at the cemetery. "Let me review the divorce files. If I remember correctly, Isabel was very clear about ensuring all legal ties were completely severed. While David investigated the legal aspects, I decided to contact Patricia O'Connor, who had been Isabel's personal assistant for the last 5 years. Patricia knew my daughter's movements and contacts better than anyone. We met that afternoon at a cafe near Isabel's office in downtown New York. Patricia, a 34-year-old woman, had always been loyal and discreet, but that day she looked nervous and uneasy. "Mr. Whitfield, there's something I need to tell you about David," she said, constantly looking around as if she was afraid of being overheard. "For the last 3 months, that man has been trying to get close to Isabel." "What do you mean, get close?" I asked, feeling my pulse quicken. "In December of last year, he started calling the office asking for Isabel. At first he used fake names, but I recognized his voice, because Isabel had talked to me about him years ago. When I told Miss Whitfield, she asked me to hang up immediately if he called again. Patricia continued to reveal details that sent a chill down my spine. In January, David showed up in person at the office. Isabel wasn't there because she had started her chemotherapy treatment, but he insisted on speaking with me. He asked me about the company's financial situation, how many stores we had, if Isabel had partners or investors. "And what did you tell him?" I asked. "Nothing, of course, but he kept pushing. He offered me $500 just to confirm if Isabel was as successful as the newspapers said." I obviously kicked him out of the office, but I later found out he had been asking the same questions at the bank where Isabel had her main accounts. This confirmed my suspicions. David hadn't appeared at the funeral by chance or out of genuine love for Isabel. He had been preparing this plan for months, investigating my daughter's financial situation while she was fighting cancer. "Patricia, do you have any proof of these advances?" I asked. "Yes, Mr. Whitfield. Isabel asked me to record all the office calls after David's first contact. I have the recordings saved on my personal computer." Those words were music to my ears. If David had admitted his true intentions during those calls, we would have solid evidence of his opportunistic behavior. The next day, Patricia brought me the recordings on a USB drive. Listening to them at my house, I felt a mix of astonishment and disgust. In one of the recordings from February 15th, David clearly said, "Look, Patricia, I know Isabel is sick. I just want to know if it's worth trying to reconcile. You know what I mean? I'm not going to waste my time if she has nothing to offer me." In another recording from March 8th, David was even more explicit. "I've heard Isabel has several $1,000,000 saved up. If that's true, I think we could resolve our past problems. We all deserve a second chance, especially when there's so much money at stake." But the most revealing recording was from March 20th, just 2 days before Isabel's death. David had called asking directly about the will. "Do you know if Isabel has made a will? Because technically, if we're still married in some legal capacity, I would have automatic rights to her estate." Now I understood David's plan completely. He had been monitoring Isabel's illness, waiting for the moment of her death to appear as the grieving husband and claim the inheritance. It was a plan as cruel as it was calculated. That same night, I received another crucial piece of information from Andrew Jennings, a former coworker of mine who had contacts in the financial sector. Andrew confirmed that David was, in fact, in serious financial trouble. "Robert, I've discreetly asked around about David Jennings. The man is completely broke. He lost his consulting firm in 2022 due to bad cryptocurrency investments. He also has gambling debts at several casinos in Las Vegas that add up to more than $80,000. The lenders are pressuring him, and according to my contacts, he's desperate to get money fast." Everything fit together perfectly. David wasn't just an opportunist, but a desperate man who saw Isabel's death as his only financial salvation. He had gambled his future on getting that inheritance, and that's why he was so confident in his legal threats. With all this information, I called David Caldwell to schedule an urgent meeting. We had solid evidence of David's fraudulent character, but we needed to prepare a solid legal strategy before he carried out his threat to initiate a lawsuit. On Friday night, as I organized all the documents and recordings, my phone rang. It was an unknown number, but when I answered, I immediately recognized David's voice. "Robert, I hope you've reconsidered my offer. On Monday, I'll file the documents with the court, and I promise you it will be much more expensive for you. Last chance, $15 million, and we can all be happy." "David," I replied with firmness, "I think you're the one who should reconsider your position. I've discovered some very interesting things about your true intentions." There was a long silence before he responded. "I don't know what you're talking about, but I'm warning you not to play games with me. I have resources and connections that can make your life very difficult. We'll see who has the better hand in this game, I said before hanging up. That night, for the first time since Isabel's death, I slept peacefully. I knew the legal battle ahead would be intense, but now I had the weapons I needed to defend my daughter's legacy and unmask the true intentions of this opportunist. On Monday, April 1st, 2024, just as he had promised, David made good on his threat. At 9 a.m., a messenger knocked on my door and handed me an official envelope from the New York County Supreme Court. When I opened it, I found a 47-page lawsuit in which David was claiming not only the $29 million, but also damages for malicious concealment of marital assets. His legal argument was convoluted but apparently well-structured. He alleged that during his marriage to Isabel, between 2012 and 2014, they had established a business partnership that was never formally dissolved. He also claimed that Isabel had used business ideas and contacts he had provided during their relationship to build her business empire. The most outrageous thing was the list of witnesses David presented to support his version of events. Names I didn't recognize. People who supposedly could confirm his participation in Isabel's initial projects. It was clear he had been preparing this farce for a long time. I immediately called David Caldwell to schedule an emergency meeting. When I arrived at his office that afternoon, I found him meticulously reviewing every page of the lawsuit with a serious expression. "Robert, I'm not going to lie to you. David has hired Christopher Miller, one of the most aggressive probate lawyers in the city. He's known for winning complicated cases by using legal technicalities and media pressure. What does that mean for us?" I asked, feeling worry creep over me. "It means they're going to play dirty. Miller has a reputation for leaking information to the press to create public pressure on his opponents. We'll probably see articles in the newspapers about the selfish father who is denying the inheritance to the successful businesswoman's widower." David was right. The next day, the sensationalist New York Ledger published an article titled "The $1 Million Battle Over Isabel Whitfield's Inheritance, Justice, or Family Greed." The article, clearly biased in David's favor, presented a completely distorted version of the facts. According to the publication, David was a successful businessman who had sacrificed his own career to support his wife's dreams and was now being unfairly excluded from the fruits of their marital collaboration. The article included a photo of David dressed in mourning at the funeral with a caption that read, "A grieving husband fights for justice." That same week, while David Caldwell prepared our legal response, I set out to find more evidence of David Jennings's true character. Patricia had mentioned that Isabel kept all her personal documents in a safe in her private office and had left me the combination in case of an emergency. When I opened the safe, I found a treasure trove of information. Isabel had been meticulous about keeping all correspondence related to her divorce, including emails David had sent her in 2014 when he left the marriage. In an email dated February 15th, 2014, David wrote, "Isabel, I need you to understand that this isn't working. I'm not ready to be a father. And frankly, your obsession with starting a business seems like a childish fantasy. I've decided to move to Los Angeles to start over. Don't try to contact me." And another email from March 3rd, 2014, was even more revealing. "I've emptied the joint account because I need that money to get settled. Consider it my compensation for the 2 years I wasted in this marriage. I hope you find a way to pay the apartment debts without involving me." But the most valuable document was a handwritten letter Isabel had drafted for her lawyer in August of 2014 during the divorce proceedings. In it, She systematically detailed all of David's manipulations and abandonment. My husband, David Jennings, abandoned me on January 28th, 2014, after learning of my pregnancy. In the following weeks, he emptied our joint bank account, taking $12,000 that were my personal savings. When I lost the baby in March due to stress, I tried to contact him to inform him, but he had blocked all communication. I formally request that the divorce decree establish that David renounces any future rights to my assets or income. This letter was notarized and had full legal value. It was the definitive proof that David had voluntarily waived all rights to Isabel's estate. Armed with this evidence, I returned to David Caldwell's office with renewed confidence. When I showed him the documents, his expression changed completely. "Robert, this is pure gold," he said with a smile. "This notarized letter proves not only David's voluntary abandonment, but also his explicit renunciation of future rights. Any judge with 2 cents of sense will dismiss his lawsuit immediately." But David Caldwell also warned me about the tactics we could expect. Miller is going to try to discredit these documents. He'll say that Isabel was emotionally disturbed during the divorce, or that circumstances have changed. He'll also try to prove that David contributed in some way to Isabel's later success. To strengthen our case, David suggested we seek testimony from people who had known David during his marriage to Isabel. We need witnesses who can confirm his abandonment and his lack of support for your daughter's business projects. I then remembered Emily White, Isabel's best friend from college. Emily had been a direct witness to my daughter's suffering during the divorce and knew the circumstances of David's abandonment perfectly. When I contacted Emily, she immediately offered to testify in our favor. "Mr. Whitfield, I was with Isabel the day David left her. I'll never forget how she cried that night, telling me she felt betrayed not only as a wife, but as a person. That man is a coward, and he can't show up now claiming rights he voluntarily abandoned." Emily also provided me with additional information about David that I didn't know. During their marriage, David never showed any interest in Isabel's business plans. On the contrary, he always ridiculed them, telling her it was a waste of time. He even forbade her from using her personal savings to hire the business consultant she wanted. With all these elements, David Caldwell began drafting our response to the lawsuit. But before filing it, we decided to take a strategic step that would put David in a very uncomfortable position. "Robert," David said to me, "we're going to ask the court to force David to present documentary evidence of his alleged contribution to Isabel's business success. If he really participated in the creation of her fortune, he must have contracts, invoices, and investment records. We know he doesn't have them, but forcing him to try and present them will reveal the fraudulent nature of his claim." That night, as I reviewed all the documents we had collected one more time, I felt a mix of sadness and determination. Isabel had been an extraordinary woman who built her success despite betrayals and abandonment. My duty as a father was to protect her legacy from the clutches of those who only saw her death as an opportunity for easy enrichment. While David prepared our legal response, Patricia contacted me with information that would completely change the course of our case. She asked me to meet her at her apartment one Thursday night, assuring me she had something explosive to show me. When I arrived at her home in Brooklyn Heights, Patricia seemed nervous but determined. "Mr. Whitfield, after our last conversation, I remembered something important. Isabel not only asked me to record David's phone calls, she also installed a recording system in her personal office after the first in-person meeting with him." Patricia turned on her laptop and showed me a folder full of audio files. Isabel was very cautious. When David showed up in January, asking about her finances, She suspected he would try to something later. That's why she decided to record any future meetings she might have with him. Were there more meetings? I asked, feeling like I was about to discover something crucial. Yes, Mr. Whitfield. 2 meetings that Isabel never told anyone about. Not even you. David visited her at her office on February 28th and again on March 14th, just a week before she passed away. Patricia played the first recording from February 28th. Listening to Isabel's voice, weak but firm, a lump formed in my throat. It was clear she was very sick already, but she maintained her dignity. David, what do you want after all these years? Isabel's voice said. Isabel, I know you're sick, and I know you've been very successful financially. I think the time has come for us to resolve our past problems, David's voice responded, in a honeyed tone. We don't have past problems, David. You abandoned me when I needed you most, and I moved on with my life. Look, let's be practical. You've built an empire of almost $30 million. I was your husband for 2 crucial years of your life. Legally, I could claim a part of that, but I'd prefer to reach an amicable agreement. Isabel's response was blunt. David, you have no right to what I have built. You signed documents waiving any future claims when we got divorced. Besides, everything I have, I built after you abandoned me. Ah, but that's where you're wrong, my dear Isabel. I've consulted with specialized lawyers, and it turns out some of those divorce documents have legal loopholes that could benefit me, especially if you die without a clear will that specifically excludes me. Those words sent a chill down my spine. David was not only planning to claim the inheritance after Isabel's death, but he was directly threatening her, hoping for her to pass away. Are you threatening me, David? I heard Isabel ask in a tone of disbelief. It's not a threat, it's a legal reality. But as I said, I prefer to resolve this civilly. If you give me, say, $5 million now, we can sign a document where I definitively renounce any future claim. I'll never give you a cent. And if you try anything legal, I promise us, I'll publicly reveal your true character and how you abandoned me when I was pregnant. Isabel, I don't think you're in a position to threaten anyone. Your illness is serious, and according to my medical information, you have only a few months left to live. Think carefully. 5 million now, or legal problems for your family after your death. The recording ended with the sound of a door slamming shut. Patricia explained that Isabel had kicked David out of her office, but he had returned 2 weeks later for an even more revealing conversation. The second recording from March 14th was even more incriminating. In it, David showed his true nature without any pretense. Isabel, I've been thinking about our previous conversation. I've done more research on your financial situation, and I think I've underestimated your assets. My contacts in the financial sector tell me you could have as much as $35 million between properties, investments, and cash. David, I don't know how you got that information, but it's completely inappropriate for you to be investigating my private finances. Look, let's be honest. You're going to die soon, and that money is going to go somewhere. Your father is an old man who doesn't need that much money. I'm 42, and I have a whole life ahead of me. We could make an arrangement that benefits everyone. An arrangement? Are you crazy? Listen to me, Isabel. I can create a lot of legal problems for your family after your death. I have lawyers who can prove that our divorce was not processed correctly in certain technical aspects. We can drag out the lawsuits for years, freezing all of your assets and ruining your family's reputation. David, you're despicable. I can't believe I was ever married to you. I'm a realist, Isabel, but I'm going to make you one last generous offer. You give me 15 million now, and I guarantee your father will inherit the rest without any problems. If you reject this proposal, I promise you I will fight for everything. And your family won't see a dollar of your fortune without going through years of legal battle. Isabel's voice in the recording sounded tired but determined. David, I want you to hear me clearly. I will never give you anything. I've modified my will specifically to exclude you from any inheritance, and I've documented all your threats. If you try anything after my death, my family will have all the proof they need to show you are a heartless opportunist. We'll see, Isabel. We'll see who has the last word on this matter. Patricia stopped the recording and looked at me with a grave expression. Mr. Whitfield, after this second visit, Isabel asked me to immediately contact her lawyer, David Coldwell, to modify the will. She also instructed me to keep these recordings in a safe place and give them to you if David tried any legal action after her death. It was incredible. Isabel, even in her last days, had been protecting my future and her own from the clutches of this manipulator. The recordings not only demonstrated David's opportunistic intentions, but also his direct threats and his illegal knowledge of confidential financial information. Patricia, how was David getting information about Isabel's finances? I asked. That's another thing I discovered, Mr. Whitfield. Last Tuesday, an employee at the bank contacted me discreetly. Apparently, David had tried to bribe one of the tellers to get information about Isabel's accounts. The employee rejected the bribe, but David insisted several times during February and March. This added another crime to David's file: attempted bribery and illegal access to bank information. With this new evidence, our case was not only solid to defend the inheritance, but we could also press criminal charges against David. That night, I called David Caldwell to inform him about the recordings. His reaction was one of total amazement. Robert, with this evidence, we're not only going to win the case, but David could face criminal charges for threats, attempted extortion, and illegal access to financial information. This changes our strategy completely. We're no longer going to play defense. We're going to go on the offensive. For the first time since Isabel's death, I felt that justice was on our side. My daughter, even from the grave, had managed to protect her legacy and give me the weapons I needed to confront this opportunist who thought he could take advantage of our grief. On May 15, 2024, the day of the first hearing at the New York County Supreme Court arrived. David Caldwell and I arrived early, loaded with wandas full of documents, recordings, and testimonies. I wore my best black suit, the same one I had worn to Isabel's funeral, feeling that somehow she would be present in that room, supporting me. At 9:30 a.m., David entered the courtroom, accompanied by his lawyer, Christopher Miller, and 3 people I didn't recognize. David was wearing an impeccable gray suit and had an expression of false solemnity, as if he were the victim in this whole matter. Judge Elena Rodriguez, a 50-something woman with a reputation for being strict but fair, opened the session by explaining the procedure. David, as the plaintiff, would have the first opportunity to present his case. Christopher Miller stood up with arrogance and began his argument. Your Honor, my client, David Jennings, was the devoted husband of Isabel Whitfield during the most formative years of her business career. During their marriage between 2012 and 2014, David provided the emotional, intellectual, and logistical support that allowed Isabel to develop the ideas that later led to her multi-million-dollar success. Miller continued with a completely distorted version of the facts. My client sacrificed his own professional opportunities to support his wife's business dreams. It was he who suggested the concept of fashion boutiques that combined high fashion with affordable prices. It was also David who introduced her to key contacts in the retail sector, who later became Isabel's business partners. Hearing these blatant lies made my blood boil, but David Caldwell had advised me to maintain my composure during the opposing party's presentation. Miller then presented his three witnesses. The first was Robert Sanchez, who identified himself as a business consultant and claimed to have known David and Isabel during their marriage. I worked with David in 2013, developing the business plan for Isabel's fashion stores, Sanchez declared under oath. David was the mastermind behind the business strategy. Isabel had the initial capital, but it was David who designed the entire operational model. The second witness was Clara Jennings, who introduced herself as a former business partner and supported the version that David had been fundamental in Isabel's first business steps. The third witness, Arthur Peterson, claimed to be an investor who had met Isabel through David and had participated in the first rounds of financing for her stores. When the testimonies of these supposed witnesses were over, David Caldwell leaned over and whispered to me, "Robert, these people are clearly lying. Their testimonies are too coordinated and specific. We're going to unmask them during cross-examination." It was David Caldwell's turn to present our case, and his strategy was brilliant. Instead of starting with legal arguments, he decided to play the recordings that Patricia had kept. "Your Honor, before we present our arguments, we want the court to hear the plaintiff's own words recorded during his meetings with the deceased Isabel Whitfield during the last months of her life. When the first recording from February 28th began to play, I saw David Jennings' expression change completely. His face went pale, and he began to whisper furiously to his lawyer. Isabel's voice filled the room. "David, you have no right to what I've built. You signed documents waiving any future claims when we got divorced." And then came David's revealing response. "I've consulted with specialized lawyers, and it turns out some of those divorce documents have legal loopholes that could benefit me, especially if you die without a clear will that specifically excludes me." The silence in the room was absolute. Judge Rodriguez was taking notes intensely as she listened to David's explicit threats against Isabel. When the part came where David said, "Your illness is serious, and according to my medical information, you have only a few months left to live. Think carefully. 5 million now, or legal problems for your family after your death?" I saw several people in the courtroom exchange looks of disgust. David Caldwell stopped the recording and addressed the judge. "Your Honor, as you can see, the plaintiff not only admits that he has no legal rights to the inheritance, but also acknowledges that he is taking advantage of the deceased's terminal illness to try and extort her." Christopher Miller immediately stood up. Objection, Your Honor. Those recordings were made without my client's consent and violate his right to privacy." Judge Rodriguez responded firmly. "Denied. The recordings were made on the deceased's private property, and the plaintiff was informed that the conversation was being recorded." "Proceed, Mr. Caldwell." David then played the second recording, the one from March 14th, where David was even more explicit about his intentions. "I can create a lot of legal problems for your family after your death. I have lawyers who can prove that our divorce was not processed correctly in certain technical aspects." When the recording ended, David presented the notarized letter Isabel had written during her divorce, where she expressly excluded David from any future claim to her assets. "Your Honor, this document signed before a notary in August of 2014 demonstrates that the deceased was absolutely clear in her intention to exclude the plaintiff from any financial benefit. Furthermore, we have Isabel Whitfield's will, drafted in January of 2024, where she specifically names her father, Robert Whitfield, as her sole universal heir. But the most devastating blow came when David called Patricia O'Connor to the stand. Patricia, in a clear and firm voice, testified about David's attempts to obtain illegal financial information about Isabel. The plaintiff tried to bribe me on multiple occasions to get confidential information about Isabel Whitfield's finances. He also tried to bribe bank employees to illegally access the deceased's accounts. All of this while she was fighting cancer. During the cross-examination of David's witnesses, David Caldwell masterfully demonstrated that their statements were fabricated. When he questioned Robert Sanchez about supposed business meetings in 2013, Sanchez could not provide specific addresses, exact dates, or documents to support his claims. Can you show the court any invoice, contract, or document that proves your alleged collaboration with Mr. Jennings in 2013? David asked. Well, those documents were lost during a move, Sanchez replied nervously. How convenient, isn't it? David countered with irony. When he questioned Clara Jennings about her supposed business partnership with Isabel, the woman also could not present documentary evidence. Even worse, when David asked her about specific details of the fashion business, it became clear she knew nothing about the retail sector. At the end of the hearing, which lasted more than 4 hours, Judge Rodriguez announced that she would study all the evidence presented and issue her decision within 15 days. When we left the courthouse, David Jennings approached me with a furious expression. This isn't over, Robert. I have the resources to appeal any adverse decision. I can keep this battle going for years. David, I replied calmly, I think that after what was heard in that room today, you should be more worried about criminal charges than the inheritance. His expression of fury transformed into one of concern. For the first time since this whole thing started, David Jennings seemed to have realized that he had gravely underestimated the situation. The 15-day wait after the hearing was the longest of my life. David Caldwell had warned me that even though we had a solid case, courts can sometimes be unpredictable, especially when so much money is involved. During that period, I decided to delve even deeper into the investigation of David and his supposed witnesses. My first discovery came through my nephew, Michael, who works in the technology department of a private investigation firm. I asked him to discreetly review the backgrounds of the 3 witnesses David had presented. Uncle Robert, I found some very interesting things about those individuals, Michael told me during a family dinner. Robert Sanchez has a history of making false statements in other trials. In 2019, he was fined for perjury in a real estate fraud case in Chicago. The information about Clara Jennings was even more revealing. This woman is an amateur actress who makes false testimonies for money. There are records that she was paid $3,000 to testify in a divorce case last year. As for Arthur Peterson, Michael discovered that he didn't even have a license as a financial investor. He's a used car salesman who was fired from his last job for scamming clients. It seemed David had specifically recruited people with questionable backgrounds to lie under oath. Armed with this information, I immediately contacted David Caldwell. We need to present this evidence to the court before they issue the judgment, I told him. Robert, this is perfect. We're going to request a supplemental hearing to present evidence of perjury. If we can prove that David organized a scheme of false testimonies, he will not only lose the case, but he'll face additional criminal charges. On May 28th, 2 days before the scheduled date for the judgment, Judge Rodriguez agreed to hear our new evidence. This time, the courtroom was even more tense. David and Miller arrived visibly nervous especially after David Caldwell had notified them about the nature of the evidence we were going to present. David began his presentation by showing the criminal record of Sanchez. Your Honor, the plaintiff's first witness has a documented history of perjury. In 2019, a Chicago court sentenced him to pay a $5,000 fine for false statements in a real estate fraud case. When he presented the evidence about Clara Jennings, Judge Rodriguez frowned with obvious disgust. This person has been paid to make false statements in multiple legal cases. We have invoices where she appears as a testimonial actress for amounts ranging from $2,000 to $4,000 per case. The most devastating information came when David Caldwell proved that Arthur Peterson had never had a license as an investor. Your Honor, this man is not only not an investor, but he was fired from his job as a car salesman for trying to scam customers with falsified documents. But the final blow came when David presented bank records that showed transfers from David to the three witnesses in the weeks leading up to the hearing. Your Honor, we have evidence that the plaintiff paid $8,000 to Sanchez, $6,000 to Jennings, and $5,000 to Peterson, exactly 10 days before their testimony in this court. The silence in the room was deafening. Judge Rodriguez looked at David with an expression of indignation I had never seen in a courtroom. Mr. Jennings, the judge said, addressing David directly, can you explain these bank transfers to people who subsequently testified under oath in your favor? David stood up, trembling, clearly unprepared to answer this evidence. Your Honor, those transfers were personal loans that have no relation to this case. Personal loans of extreme amounts to 3 different people who just happened to testify in your favor, the judge replied with sarcasm. Miller tried to intervene. Your Honor, my client has the right to the presumption of innocence. Silence, Judge Rodriguez interrupted. This court will not tolerate attempts to manipulate justice through purchased testimonies. Mr. Jennings has not only presented false witnesses, but has organized a deliberate scheme of perjury. The judge then did something that completely surprised me. She ordered the immediate arrest of the 3 false witnesses and scheduled a separate criminal hearing for David on charges of witness bribery and obstruction of justice. As for the main case, the judge continued, based on the evidence presented by the defendant, Robert Whitfield, this court finds that the lawsuit of Mr. David Jennings is completely unfounded and fraudulent. The judge proceeded to read her decision. First, the recordings presented unequivocally demonstrate that the plaintiff admitted to having no legal rights to the inheritance of Isabel Whitfield. Second, the deceased's will is absolutely valid and expressly excludes the plaintiff from any benefit. Third, the notarized letter from 2014 clearly establishes the plaintiff's voluntary renunciation of future claims to her assets. Furthermore, the judge continued, this court finds that the plaintiff attempted to extort the deceased during her terminal illness, taking advantage of her vulnerability to obtain illegal financial benefits. The judgment was final. The lawsuit of Mr. David Jennings is completely denied. It is confirmed that Robert Whitfield is the sole and legitimate universal heir of Isabel Whitfield. Furthermore, the plaintiff is ordered to pay all legal costs and is fined $50,000 for presenting false testimonies. But the judge wasn't finished. Finally, this court orders that a criminal investigation be opened against David Jennings for the crimes of threats, attempted extortion, witness bribery, and obstruction of justice. The plaintiff is prohibited from leaving the country until the criminal investigation is concluded. When the judge finished reading the sentence, David was completely slumped in his chair. His face had lost all color, and Miller looked like he wanted to disappear under the table. As we left the courthouse, several journalists who had been following the case were waiting for us. David Caldwell, had prepared a brief statement. Justice has prevailed. Mr. Robert Whitfield has successfully defended his daughter's legacy against fraudulent attempts at appropriation. Isabel Whitfield's memory remains intact, and her testamentary will has been fully respected. That afternoon, in the tranquility of my home, I reread Isabel's will for the 100th time. In one of her final clauses, she had written, "Dad, I hope you never have to use this document to defend yourself from unscrupulous people. But if that moment comes, remember that I built all of this thinking of your future and to honor Mom's memory. Don't let anyone tarnish our family's legacy." For the first time since her death, I felt that Isabel could rest in peace. Her last battle had been won, and her legacy was protected forever from the clutches of those who only saw money where they should have seen love, sacrifice, and honest work. The days following the an avalanche of revelations that neither David nor I could have anticipated. The legal victory had opened the floodgates, and people who were previously afraid to speak began to contact me with additional information about David's true activities. The first to reach out was Jane Evans, a 45-year-old woman who identified herself as David's ex-girlfriend between 2018 and 2020. Jane called me on June 2nd, 3 days after the newspapers published the news of the judgment. "Mr. Whitfield, I've been following the case in the news, and I think you need to know more things about David Jennings," she said in a trembling voice during our phone conversation. "That man put me through a similar hell to what he put your daughter through." We agreed to meet at a cafe in downtown New York, where Jane told me a story that made my blood run cold. David seduced me in 2018 when I had just inherited a property from my father. At first, he seemed like the perfect man, attentive, caring, interested in my well-being. But I later found out he had been investigating my financial situation before approaching me. Jane continued to recount how David had used the same manipulative tactics he tried with Isabel. During the 2 years we were together, he constantly pressured me to lend him money for his supposed investment projects. When we broke up in 2020, I discovered he had stolen $35,000 from my bank account, using information he had obtained from me during our relationship. "Did you file a complaint?" I asked. I tried to, but David threatened to ruin my professional reputation if I took him to court. I work as a marketing director at a major company, and he knew people who could have caused me problems at work. In the end, I decided to consider that money the price of getting rid of him. But Jane was not David's only victim. That same week, I was visited by Michael Miller, a retired businessman of 58 who had met David at a poker club in 2021. "Mr. Whitfield, that man is a financial predator," Michael told me during our meeting. "He approached me at the casino, pretending to be a successful investment consultant. He convinced me to invest $80,000 in a supposed investment fund he was managing." Michael showed me documents that proved how David had created a shell company called Jennings and Associates Investments to scam elderly people with considerable savings. When I tried to withdraw my investment 6 months later, I discovered that the company didn't really exist, and that David had used my money to cover his gambling debts. "Did he also threaten you to prevent you from filing a complaint?" I asked, suspecting the pattern. "Exactly. He told me he had police contacts who could make my life difficult. Plus, he blackmailed me with compromising photos he had secretly taken during a business meeting where I had drunk too much. These revelations motivated me to seek out more of David's victims. I contacted a private investigator recommended by David Caldwell, Chris Thompson, who specialized in financial fraud cases. Chris discovered that David had operated a systematic scheme of scams for the last 10 years. "Mr. Whitfield, this man has a very specific method. He investigates people who are vulnerable or in life transitions, recent divorcees, widows with inheritances, struggling business owners, elderly people with savings. Then he approaches them, feigning romantic or professional interest to gain their trust and access their financial resources. Chris's report revealed at least 12 documented victims between 2014 and 2024, with total losses exceeding $400,000. Each case followed the same pattern: seduction, manipulation, extraction of money, and then threats to prevent complaints. The most disturbing thing, Chris continued, is that David keeps detailed files on his victims, compromising photos, secret recordings, personal information he uses to blackmail them if they try to get their money back. With all this information, David Caldwell and I decided to contact the New York State Attorney General's office to file a broader case against David. The assigned prosecutor, Robert Smith, was extremely interested in the evidence we had collected. Gentlemen, what you are presenting to me is not just a case of fraudulent inheritance, but a systematic criminal operation that has been running for a decade, Prosecutor Smith told us. With the testimonies and evidence you have, we can prosecute David Jennings for continuous fraud, threats, blackmail, and illegal association for criminal purposes. But the most shocking revelation came when Patricia contacted me again with information she had discovered while reviewing Isabel's files. Mr. Whitfield, I found something unsettling in Isabel's call records from last year. During November and December of 2023, David was not only calling her directly, but he had also been contacting several of the store's clients and suppliers, asking about the business's financial health. Patricia showed me a list of more than 20 business contacts David had tried to question about Isabel's finances. Some of these suppliers called me at the time to ask if they should give him information, because David was presenting himself as a family consultant hired by Isabel to evaluate the business. Did Isabel know about these contacts? I asked. Yes, Mr. Whitfield. That's why she intensified the security measures at the company and installed the recording systems. Isabel suspected David was preparing something big, but we never imagined it would be so systematic and cruel. That additional information proved that David had been planning his inheritance appropriation strategy for at least 6 months before Isabel's death. He wasn't a makeshift opportunist, but a calculated predator who had been waiting for my daughter's moment of greatest vulnerability to execute his plan. On June 10th, Prosecutor Smith informed me that David had been formally charged with 10 different criminal counts. Mr. Whitfield, thanks to your perseverance and the evidence you provided, we are going to prosecute this individual for all his crimes. The other victims you located have also decided to testify, so David is facing decades in prison if he is convicted. That night, as I organized all the case documents, I reflected on the true extent of David's malice. He hadn't just been an opportunistic ex-husband trying to appropriate an inheritance, but a professional criminal who had turned the suffering of others into his way of life. Isabel, without knowing it, had become the victim who finally exposed David's entire criminal network. Her courage to document his threats and her foresight to protect the evidence had not only saved our family inheritance, but had put an end to a decade of crimes against innocent people. On June 18, 2024, when it seemed the case was resolved and David would finally face the consequences of his actions, I received a call that changed my perspective on everything I had experienced during these months. It was from a woman named Hope Sanders, who identified herself as Isabel's second cousin and lived in Seattle. Robert, I've been following David's case in the news, and I think there's something else you need to know about Isabel's death, she said, her voice choked with emotion. Her words made my blood run cold. What do you mean, something else? I asked. I'd rather tell you in person. Could you come to Seattle this weekend? It's about Isabel's last days in the hospital. The trip to Seattle was one of the most agonizing of my life. During the 3-hour journey, my mind created increasingly terrible scenarios about what Hope might reveal to me. She worked as a nurse at Harborview Medical Center in Seattle. And although she hadn't directly cared for Isabel, she had contacts in the hospital system in New York. We met at her apartment on Saturday morning. Hope, a 52-year-old woman with 20 years of experience in oncology, greeted me with a grave expression and medical documents in her hands. Robert, a colleague of mine from New York Presbyterian Hospital, contacted me after seeing the news about David. She told me something that had been bothering her since Isabel's death, but that she hadn't dared to report. Until now. Hope showed me hospital visit records that her colleague had discreetly copied. According to these documents, David visited Isabel at the hospital on 3 occasions during March, always when you weren't present. The visits were on the 5th, 12th, and 19th of March. That's impossible, I replied immediately. Isabel had expressly forbidden me from allowing David's visits. Besides, I was practically living at the hospital during her last days. Exactly. That's why these visits are so strange. According to the records, David presented himself as Isabel's legal husband and had falsified documents that supposedly gave him authorization to visit her during the night shifts. Hope continued to explain what her colleague had observed during the visit on March 19th, just 3 days before Isabel's death. David was in the room for more than 2 hours. The nurse on duty found it strange that Isabel was very agitated after that visit and that her vital signs had worsened significantly. Are you suggesting that David could have, I couldn't finish the sentence. I'm not suggesting anything specific, Robert, but my colleague told me that Isabel asked her that night not to allow any more visits from David and that she was very scared. She also mentioned something about not letting him force me to sign anything. Those words hit me like a lightning bolt. Had David tried to force Isabel to modify her will during her last days? Had he used her vulnerable state to pressure her while I wasn't present? Hope handed me a copy of the nurse's notes from that night. They read, "Patient very agitated after family visit. Requests no more visits from husband. Mentions concern about legal documents. Mild sedative administered to calm anxiety." Robert, there's something else. My colleague checked the hospital's security cameras from that night. David left the room carrying a folder that he didn't have when he entered. I immediately called David Caldwell from Seattle to inform him about these revelations. His reaction was one of total alarm. Robert, we need to investigate this immediately. If David tried to coerce Isabel during her terminal illness to modify legal documents, we'd be talking about a much more serious crime. Get back to New York immediately. On Monday morning, David Caldwell and I met with Prosecutor Smith to present this new evidence. The prosecutor immediately ordered a review of all the hospital's security cameras and that the staff who had been on duty during David's visits be questioned. 3 days later, the prosecutor called us in with information that exceeded our worst suspicions. Gentlemen, we have reviewed the security recordings and confirmed that David Jennings illegally visited Isabel Whitfield on multiple occasions using falsified documentation. The prosecutor continued, "Even more serious, we have found in David's possession a copy of Isabel's original will with handwritten modifications that were intended to include him as a beneficiary of 40% of the inheritance. These modifications are dated March 19th, the same day as his last hospital visit." Are you saying David tried to falsify Isabel's will? I asked, feeling indignation well up inside me. Exactly. We have evidence that David took falsified documents into Isabel's room and tried to force her to sign modifications to the will. According to the nurse's testimony, Isabel flatly refused and threatened to report him, which would explain her state of agitation that night. David Caldwell intervened. Prosecutor Smith, this constitutes attempted coercion of a sick person, falsification of documents, and possibly attempted homicide if the stress caused contributed to Isabel's deterioration. Correct, Mr. Caldwell. We have added these charges to the indictment against David Jennings. He now faces the possibility of 25 years in prison. But the most shocking revelation came when the prosecutor showed us the complete contents of the folder David had taken from the hospital. In addition to the falsified will, David had prepared documents of a durable power of attorney that would have given him total control over Isabel's assets in case she had survived in a vegetative state. What does that mean? I asked. It means David had an alternative plan. If Isabel didn't die immediately, he would have tried to have her declared mentally incapacitated and assume control of her entire fortune as a caring spouse. It was a diabolical plan designed to appropriate the $29 million, regardless of whether Isabel lived or died. That revelation affected me deeply. For all these months, I had thought David was simply an opportunist who had appeared after Isabel's death to claim money. Now I was discovering he had been much worse, a predator who had been stalking my daughter during her last days, trying to take advantage of her extreme vulnerability to steal everything she had built. There's one more thing, Mr. Whitfield, the prosecutor continued. We have found evidence that David had been monitoring Isabel's health status through illegal contacts in the hospital system. He knew exactly when she would be most vulnerable and planned his visits accordingly. When we left the prosecutor's office that afternoon, David Caldwell put a hand on my shoulder. Robert, I know these revelations are painful, but they also prove something very important. Isabel fought until the end to protect her legacy and yours. Even in her last days, she faced David and refused to give in to his pressure. That night, in the solitude of my home, I reread the letters Isabel had written me during her illness one last time. In one of them, dated March 20th, just 2 days before her death, there was a line that now took on new meaning. Dad, if something happens to me, make sure my will is respected. Don't let anyone manipulate what we've built together. Isabel had known exactly what David was trying to do, and had fought until her last breath to protect our future. Her courage and determination had not only preserved the family inheritance, but had exposed the true criminal nature of a man who had turned the suffering of others into his way of life. On July 15th, 2024, almost 4 months after Isabel's funeral, the day of the criminal trial against David Jennings arrived. Criminal court was packed with journalists, David's victims, and onlookers who had followed the case through the media. David arrived at the courthouse in handcuffs and escorted by 2 U.S. Marshals. His appearance had changed dramatically during the months he had spent in pre-trial detention. The arrogant, well-dressed man who had appeared at Isabel's funeral now looked haggard, with unkempt hair and an expression of total defeat. The presiding judge, Judge Jessica Thompson, a magistrate with more than 15 years of experience in organized crime cases, opened the session by reading the 14 criminal charges against David: continuous fraud, falsification of documents, threats, coercion, blackmail, witness bribery, professional trespassing, and violation of court orders. Prosecutor Smith began his presentation with a detailed timeline of David's crimes over the last decade. Your Honor, the defendant, David Jennings, is not an occasional criminal, but a systematic predator who has built his entire adult life by taking advantage of vulnerable people. Over the next 3 hours, the prosecutor presented testimonies from David's 12 identified victims. Each story followed the same macabre pattern: seduction, manipulation, extraction of resources, and threats to prevent complaints. Jane Evans testified in a clear, firm voice. David stole $35,000 from me using information he had obtained during our intimate relationship. When I tried to get my money back, he threatened to destroy my professional career and leak private photos he had taken without my consent. Michael Miller, narrated how David had created the shell company, Jennings and Associates Investments, to scam him. That man stole my life savings, the $80,000 I had saved for my retirement. When I discovered the fraud, he blackmailed me with compromising photos to prevent me from filing a complaint. But the most shocking testimony was from Nurse Sarah Lopez, who had cared for Isabel during her last days. Sarah testified about David's illegal hospital visits and his attempt to coerce Isabel into modifying her will. The defendant showed up multiple times using falsified documentation, identifying himself as the patient's legal husband. During his last visit on March 19th, Ms. Whitfield became extremely agitated. She specifically asked me not to allow any more visits from this man, saying verbatim, "Don't let him try to force me to sign anything again." The most devastating evidence came when the prosecutor presented the hospital's security recordings that showed David leaving Isabel's room with documents he didn't have when he entered. The falsified documents David had prepared, including the modified will and the fraudulent powers of attorney, were also presented. "Your Honor," the prosecutor continued, "the defendant not only attempted to appropriate an inheritance that was not his, but also harassed a dying woman during her last days, taking advantage of her state of extreme vulnerability to try and steal $29 million. When it was the defense's turn, David's lawyer, who had replaced Christopher Miller after he had disassociated himself from the case and tried to present a defense based on temporary insanity and gambling addiction. "Your Honor, my client has been fighting a severe gambling addiction that led him to make desperate decisions. He is not a professional criminal, but a sick man who needs treatment, not prison." But this strategy fell apart when the prosecutor presented evidence of David's meticulous planning. Investigators had found a complete file in his apartment with detailed information about all his victims, including photos, financial records, and specific strategies to manipulate each one. "Your Honor," the prosecutor counterordered, "a gambling addict doesn't maintain organized files on his victims for 10 years. A gambling addict doesn't falsify professional documents or create shell companies. What we have here is a professional criminal who has perfected his method over a decade." The most emotional moment of the trial came when I was allowed to read a victim impact statement as Isabel's father. With a trembling but firm voice, I addressed the court. "Your Honor, David Jennings not only tried to steal the money my daughter built with so much effort, he profaned her memory, tortured her last days, and turned our family grief into a legal nightmare. Isabel died thinking this man might destroy everything she had worked to protect. My daughter fought cancer for 4 months with extraordinary bravery, but she also had to fight against the threats and blackmail of this predator during her most vulnerable moments. David is not just a thief. He's someone who feeds on the suffering of others." After 2 days of testimonies and evidence presentation, Judge Thompson announced a 2-hour recess for deliberation. During that wait, David Caldwell and I sat on the benches in the courthouse hallway, surrounded by David's other victims who had come to witness the verdict. "Robert," David Caldwell said to me, "regardless of what the judge decides, we have already won the most important battle. David will never be able to touch Isabel's inheritance, and his criminal network has been completely dismantled." When we returned to the courtroom, Judge Thompson began to read her verdict in a clear and firm voice. "After reviewing all the evidence presented, this court finds the defendant, David Jennings, guilty of all the charges filed against him. The verdict was final. The defendant is sentenced to 18 years in prison for continuous fraud, an additional 3 years for falsification of documents, 2 years for threats and coercion, and 2 years for witness bribery, for a total of 25 years of effective imprisonment. Furthermore," the judge continued, "it is ordered that the defendant pay a total restitution of $847,000 to his victims, plus the legal costs of the trial. The defendant is permanently prohibited from engaging in any activity related to financial consulting or wealth management. When the judge finished reading the sentence, David completely collapsed in his chair. His lawyer tried to console him, but it was clear that the weight of his crimes had finally fallen upon him. As we left the courthouse, David's other victims surrounded me, all expressing gratitude for my courage in standing up to him. "Mr. Whitfield," Jane said to me, "if you hadn't fought so hard for your daughter's memory, David would still be free, stealing from and threatening more innocent people." That night, as I had dinner alone at my house, I reflected on the 4 months that had passed since Isabel's death. The legal battle was over. David would face decades in prison, and my daughter's inheritance was completely protected. But even more importantly, Isabel's memory had been vindicated, and her legacy would remain intact forever. 6 months after David's trial, on January 15th, 2025, I found myself sitting in Isabel's former office, surrounded by architects, lawyers, and representatives from charitable organizations. That day would mark the beginning of a new chapter in my daughter's legacy, one she had dreamed of, but that circumstances had not allowed her to see realized. In the months following David's conviction, I had had time to reflect deeply on what to do with the $29 million inheritance Isabel had left me. At 68 years old, I didn't need so much money to live comfortably for the rest of my days. I knew that Isabel would have wanted her fortune to be used for something bigger than my personal well-being. In her personal letters, which I had read countless times, Isabel had repeatedly mentioned her dream of helping female entrepreneurs who faced similar difficulties to the ones she had experienced during her divorce. "Dad," she had written in one of her last letters, "if something happens to me, I'd like for a part of what I've built to be used to help other women who are struggling to get ahead after being abandoned." Inspired by this, I had decided to create the Isabel Whitfield Foundation for Women Entrepreneurs. The foundation would be dedicated to providing interest-free loans, free legal advice, and emotional support to women who had been victims of marital abandonment and wanted to start their own businesses. Patricia O'Connor, who had been Isabel's right-hand woman for years, had agreed to direct the foundation. "Mr. Whitfield," she had told me when I offered her the position, "it would be an honor to continue Isabel's work in this way." She always said she wanted to use her success to help other women find their financial independence. The foundation's headquarters would be established in the same building where Isabel had had her main offices. We had allocated $15 million as the initial endowment, which would guarantee the foundation's operation for decades. I would keep the other $14 million as a family reserve and for my living expenses. During the inauguration ceremony, held exactly 1 year after Isabel's death, many of the people who had been important in her life were present. Emily White, her best friend from college, gave an emotional speech. Isabel was a woman who transformed pain into strength, adversity into opportunity. When David abandoned her, pregnant and without resources, she didn't just wallow in her sorrow. She channeled that experience into the determination to never again depend on anyone for her financial well-being. This foundation represents exactly what Isabel would have wanted, to turn her personal story into hope for other women. David Caldwell, who had been fundamental throughout the legal battle, also spoke at the ceremony. "I have seen many cases of disputed inheritances throughout my career, but I have never witnessed a struggle as noble as the one Robert Whitfield fought to protect his daughter's memory. Isabel can rest in peace, knowing that her legacy was not only preserved, but has become a source of hope for future generations." But the most significant moment of the ceremony came when Jane Evans, one of David's victims, who was now working as a volunteer advisor for the foundation, read the first application for help we had received. Maria Rodriguez, 34 years old, mother of two, abandoned by her husband after 12 years of marriage. She is requesting a loan of $25,000 to open a bakery and be able to support her children independently. It was exactly the kind of case Isabel would have fought tooth and nail for. Over the following months, the foundation began operating at full capacity. We received between 50 and 100 applications a month from women all over the country seeking support to start their businesses. Our team of advisors, which included several of David's victims who had decided to turn their experience into help for others, evaluated each case with the same care Isabel would have put into her own businesses. In March of 2025, I received a letter that moved me deeply. It was from Maria Rodriguez, the foundation's first beneficiary, informing me that her bakery had been a resounding success and that she had already been able to hire 3 additional employees. "Mr. Whitfield," Maria wrote, "you not only helped me financially, but you gave me the confidence to believe in myself again. When my husband abandoned me, I thought my life was over. Now I know it was actually just beginning. Every loaf of bread I bake carries a little of the hope that Isabel transmitted to me through her foundation." In April, I received another piece of news that filled me with satisfaction. David had appealed his sentence, but the New York Court of Appeals had confirmed the 25-year prison sentence. Furthermore, he had begun paying restitution to his victims from prison, working in the prison's carpentry workshop. Robert, David Caldwell, informed me during one of our monthly meetings, "David has lost all his appeals. He will spend the next 25 years in prison, and when he gets out, he'll be a 67-year-old man with no resources or reputation. Justice has finally prevailed completely." But beyond the satisfaction of seeing David paying for his crimes, what truly filled me with peace was seeing how Isabel's legacy continued to grow. By the end of 2025, the foundation had helped more than 200 women start their own businesses, creating more than 800 indirect jobs across the country. Patricia regularly informed me about the progress of our beneficiaries. "Mr. Whitfield, we have an 87% success rate in the businesses we have funded. This means Isabel not only built her own fortune, but has helped create hundreds of small family fortunes throughout the country." In December of 2025, 2 years after Isabel's death, I hosted a Christmas dinner for all the people who had been important during this extraordinary journey. David, Patricia, Emily, Jane, Michael, and many of the foundation's beneficiaries gathered at my house to celebrate not only Christmas, but the triumph of justice and solidarity over greed and evil. During the dinner, I read a paragraph aloud from the last letter Isabel had written to me. "Dad, if you are reading this, it means I am no longer with you. But I want you to know that everything I built was with our family's future in mind and the possibility of helping other people who go through the difficulties I lived through. Don't let sadness paralyze you. Use what I have left for you to create something beautiful that honors Mom's memory and mine." That night, as my guests shared stories of success and hope, I looked at the photograph of Isabel that presided over the dining room and knew she would be proud of what we had accomplished together. Her death had been the end of her personal story, but it had marked the beginning of hundreds of stories of hope and overcoming. David Jennings had believed he could appropriate Isabella's legacy through lies and manipulation. But what he hadn't understood was that my daughter's true legacy was not in the $29 million she had accumulated, but in her indomitable spirit, her generosity, and her ability to transform suffering into strength to help others. Isabel had won the final battle, not only by protecting her inheritance from the clutches of an opportunist, but by turning that inheritance into a seed of hope for hundreds of women who, like her, had refused to give up in the face of adversity. If you liked this story, give the video a like, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. To hear the next story, click on the box to the left. Thanks for watching.